It's time for us to get into the nitty gritty of this upcoming college football season. And who better to do that with than with Mike Golic Jr. from DraftKings, our good friend. We're going to come back and talk to him in just a moment here on this episode of Locked On Wolverines.
You are Locked On Wolverines, your daily podcast on the Michigan Wolverines, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
All right, as promised, we have got Mike Golic Jr. of DraftKings. And of course, I've got a junk call coming in all of a sudden. So that's the welcome call, I guess.
Yeah, know how that goes all the time, man. It's usually the best laid plans interrupted by something. That's how it is. We roll with the punches, though.
Indeed, man. Well, nonetheless, I'm your man on the ground, Isaiah Hole, publisher of Wolverines Wire. We got Mike Golic Jr. over there to my I don't know if you're my left or right. I'm not looking at the screen, but you're over there. So before we get into your thoughts on Michigan football, I do want to get some of your thoughts in general about the landscape of college football, because I feel like the kind of consensus of what everyone kind of thought it was going to be. You know, it feels like normally, once you reach like spring ball throughout this entire kind of era, you generally have a pretty good idea of what everyone's going to pick, who everyone's going to pick, what the top 10 is. But I'm starting to see some kind of wildly different things as far as what the national media is saying about the college football landscape. So with that in mind, I kind of want to know what your thoughts are. What teams are you looking out for? Which ones do you think are going to be at the top? What questions do you have? Give me your 30,000 foot view.
Yeah, well, I think part of this is, the obvious answer in the room is the transfer portal has made roster construction in college football a little bit different over the last few years. You combine that with the extra COVID year guys and all the different changes we've had there, where we don't feel like we've got a firm handle on who's going to be suiting up for every team, with notable exceptions. Like you mentioned, the upper crust of the sport is going to be a little bit more consistent in this regard. But some of the teams that have a chance to make noise in there, you're seeing them working the second transfer portal window around spring practice. I even saw somebody jump into the portal today. So all these different things that kind of affect the way that we judge these rosters as we're trying to go, all right, well, I might have remembered the player in the context of this offense. How do they fit into what this new team is doing? How quickly do we think they're going to be able to assimilate? You've got that in conjunction with all the coordinator changes. And so it makes it pretty difficult. But to your question about the teams that we can all easily identify, right? Going to be a lot of the same names in this. I mean, Michigan's going to be one of them. Extremely veteran team that comes back, brings back the majority of its coaching staff, pretty much all of its important coaching staff, plus, experienced defense, especially at the linebacker level, and a schedule that once again stacks up pretty favorably before you get to the month of November for them, which we know is going to be important with the potential looming Harbaugh suspension and the ramifications during the early portion of the schedule here. But you've got them in that same way. A lot of people in the Big Ten obviously going to be high on Ohio State and Penn State, the teams that perennially bring in top-end talent. Penn State, great running back tandem, a really strong defensive line, but you're also replacing a guy in Sean Clifford that, while he was certainly imperfect, the Sean Clifford roller coaster ride to me is emblematic of what having a pretty good college quarterback is like. It's a lot of ups, it's a lot of downs, but now, you bring in Drew Allar and you love all the talent there. Penn State fans, I'm sure, wanted to see even more of him last year, but it's still a guy you just haven't seen enough of. And we know that's a position that can swing a lot. The same can be said of Ohio State, where, I've seen Ryan Day laud the quarterback depth that they've got right now, but haven't really heard a lot of mention about, hey, how the top end starting spot is going to be there. You're always going to have talent around there, one of the best wide receiver rooms in the country, but a lot of change there at an important position. Same can be said for a team like Alabama that's dealing with that. And so it's going to be a lot of similar names, I think, in the Big Ten, in the SEC, where it's Georgia's until proven otherwise. Certainly Alabama's going to be in the mix if they can get the quarterback situation figured out. What Brian Kelly did in year one, getting LSU to Atlanta in the SEC championship game against Georgia, I think it's reasonable to expect, hey, you might even have to go a step further now. With all the talent you've got there, bringing Jayden Daniels back, what's going to be expected of that team? The East is fascinating behind Georgia in that regard. Can Joe Milton in Tennessee, who's, to me, one of the most interesting questions in college football this year, What do they do in the context of that offense with a player who we know, arm cannon, everything that we've ever wanted ability-wise in a player, backflips, you name it. He's got all the Anthony Richardson stuff to his game, but we haven't seen him at any of his stops between Michigan and here put it together. Can that possibly be the case? And I think for me, the biggest one, though, is what happens with the Pac-12. We've spent so much time talking about media rights deals, the future of the conference. You've got the deepest quarterback roster, bar none, in college football existing inside this conference as far as high-end talent, starting with the reigning Heisman Trophy winner and Caleb Williams. But then you go Michael Penix Jr. at Washington. You've got Bo Nix at Oregon. You've got DJU trying to resurrect his career at Oregon State and Jonathan Smith's offense. And you can keep going on and on through this conference. It's a fascinating place to get high-end offensive football, but can they get out of their own way and not cannibalizing? Is Utah the one that we should be picking until further notice with Cam Rising and a veteran team around him? And can they finally send someone back to the college football playoff? Is USC going to be able to keep Caleb Williams healthy long enough and finally get Alex Grinch's defense to stop somebody long enough to get them into the dance that we believe with Lincoln Riley, that offense and what they've done in the portal, they can get to? So I know it's a long-winded answer and there's a lot of things I just threw at you, but I think though in general, it's a lot of the same players, but turnover at some really important positions. You know, we didn't even get to the ACC that also has a quarterback that'll be mentioned near the top of the draft in Drake May, trying to go up against the likes of Clemson at a major crossroads, Florida State making a push finally, bringing back so much depth and really working the portal there. It's so much exciting on the field stuff in college football that's kind of been pushed to the back burner by everything we've seen talked about in the business of the sport.
Well, while there was a lot there's kind of a common denominator, two common denominators that were kind of throughout all the things that you were mentioning there. And that's the quarterback position, right? Because we're talking about, all of teams like Michigan, like USC, Washington, who return their quarterbacks. And then you compare that to all these other teams where they lose quarterbacks that were in a lot of ways the best of the best, right? CJ Stroud, Bryce Young. I know that he wasn't necessarily highly drafted. It wasn't highly rated, but Stetson Bennett won 2 national championships. How confident are you that some of these teams breaking in new quarterbacks are going to be able to get at least that same level of play? Do you look at any of these quarterbacks across the country and say, that guy is an upgrade on the guy that's leaving? Or are you a little leery of some of these situations and some of the quarterbacks that are coming in to replace the previous starter?
Yeah, I think Georgia's an interesting one to consider too, just because the thing we don't often bring up as much. And I will say the interesting test for Georgia in this regard is, can you show yourself to be coordinator agnostic, right? Todd Monken's been a big part of their success there. The Stetson Bennett conversation really also lends itself to a Todd Monken conversation and what he did with the offensive personnel that they had there. And so now breaking in new coordinator this year as Todd Monken's headed to Baltimore and Stetson Bennett's gone. Carson Beck, you look at the talent in the rest of that room, there's a bunch of dudes in there. And so you'd expect that to go in, even though Kirby Smart's always kind of had this kink for quarterbacks that maybe are a little less than the ability side. See what happened when Justin Fields was on campus there. But I think that one's fascinating to me just because we know they're going to have talent. We know defensively what the standard is around that program, even if it's not the Space Aliens from 2021. There's still plenty of talent across the board. But I just want to see, all right, if the defense steps back a little bit at all ever, can an offense now that's dealing with a new voice at the helm do what Alabama's done and show, hey, no matter who we roll through here, going to be the same basic stuff that we do. You're going to always be building on our package instead of replacing things wholesale and make that thing run regardless of who we've got back there. I'm pretty confident in that because they've still got a hell of a meat slab in front of whoever's going to be throwing footballs around there that's going to be protecting and pushing people around. But it is interesting in that regard. And, he's not the only one. Coordinator, even with quarterback coming back. We talked about Oregon before. Dan Lanning out there certainly feeling good, new extension, all those things. But Kenny Dillingham, now going over the head coach at Arizona State, I thought was a huge part of the resurrection of Bo Nix and his reputation across college football last year. How does that look this season? So those are definitely, I think, interesting situations to monitor with all the newness around certain positions like that. Hell, in my own backyard in South Bend, we're all pumped up to have Sam Hartman there, guy who's done everything you can possibly do in the ACC at the helm for Wake Forest in a very different offense. And Now, you've got Jared Parker taking over for Tommy Rees. Jared Parker, who was with Neil Brown in West Virginia, wasn't always calling plays, but involved in building it. We're not really sure what that's going to look like either, as there's a lot of newness there. And so, yeah, it's always like, an interesting jigsaw puzzle, whether it's the portal with players or coaches moving on and taking other jobs, and how shuffling that deck can sort of morph the identity of some of these teams.
Well, I want to get into Michigan football and your thoughts on Michigan, because I'm sure that your opinion has certainly changed year over year based off of where you stood last year than what Michigan did. I think only those of us who were in and around Ann Arbor had the opinion that Michigan was going to do basically what it did last year. So I don't fault you for thinking that it was going to not necessarily be a great year for the Wolverines, but certainly I can see very few people that are thinking that it's not going to be a great year for Michigan. So I want to hear your thoughts on that in just one moment. Before we do get to that, I do have to tell you, these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. And that's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Anytime you need to find the right team member, you're out there in the transfer portal looking for your quarterback, your cornerback, whatever it is. LinkedIn Jobs has got you covered there. And it's so easy to create a job opportunity on LinkedIn Jobs. Just add your job, the purple hashtag hiring frame, to your LinkedIn profile, and you can spread the word that you are hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so that you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. Just like Michigan went out and got Josh Wallace, went out and got Drake Nugent, got those pieces they need so that they feel like they can go out and win a championship. That's what you can do with LinkedIn Jobs for your company. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to, and they help you do it faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. All right, Mike, we are back with Mike Golic Jr., DraftKings, and all over the place. I mean, I feel like I see you on TV. I hear you on radio. You're all over the place these days, which makes sense because you're an absolute pro. You're a pro's pro. So I'm excited that you are joining us once again to discuss this season, which is weirdly just right around the corner after all of this waiting. Michigan football. I don't even want to ask you too much about. I don't want to ask you anything leading in the sense. I just want your thoughts. When people say Michigan football, what is it going into this year? What are your thoughts? What do you think of this team?
I mean, should be a playoff team. Like, that's the standard now. And it's just, we've heard all the stuff about, the beat Georgia practice period and everyone joking that it should really be a beat TCU practice period. But jokes aside, this should be a playoff team, right? They're an old team. They've got a quarterback that they trust in JJ McCarthy, who's coming back. They've got an offensive line that's back-to-back Joe Moore Award winners with a ton of experience returning. And a guy in Blake Corum who, listen, when healthy, was a guy I looked at last year and had on my Heisman ballot. Like, all of these things together combined with, like we said, experience on defense, albeit not up front in a group that helped get after the quarterback a ton. They should be a playoff team. And it's going to be, hey, once you get there, can you stick with your identity on that stage and let that be good enough? Because I thought for me, that was the biggest takeaway of the bowl loss to TCU last year was it seemed like Michigan was not themselves in the first half of that game. And by the time they opted to do so, it was too late. And so can that be good enough? Because you've built yourself to be the bully, right? That's how you've gotten past Ohio State in the last couple of years. But the next step then becomes, too, part of that Ohio State win this year, I thought was just as much, you finished the game like a hammer. Big runs down the stretch that were able to get them over the hump. You made big plays in the passing game early on in there. JJ McCarthy hit some YOLO throws against some pressures from Ohio State and that Jim Dole's defense that broke through and got them what they needed. That wasn't a consistent part of the arsenal for Michigan football over the course of last season. I remember calling the game in the big house against Michigan State before all the tunnel nonsense and going, all right, well, this secondary is a great spot and a great proving ground to try and go and explore more of your downfield passing game. And they never did it. They waited all the way until that Ohio State game. but it was never really a consistent part of the repertoire. I know Jim Harbaugh has been out here pumping up the tires on JJ McCarthy and talking about what he thinks he is as a quarterback around this landscape, but we need to see that in use more consistently. I think if Michigan's going to get over the hump of some of those teams that they are eyeing in these, in the upper echelon of the college football playoff, if national championship caliber team is something they want to add to the resume.
Now, we just spent a large portion of the last segment discussing quarterbacks around the country. So I think it's probably apropos to talk a little bit about the fact that Michigan does have that returning quarterback. And JJ McCarthy, every time I see a returning quarterback ranking across college football, it makes sense. The guys that are ahead of him in a lot of ways, you look at Drake May, you look at Michael Penix and some of those types of guys. Sam Hartman and JJ seem to be kind of 7, 8, depending on where you put them. I mean, you've gotten to see JJ McCarthy in person. You've seen him on TV. You've seen all of those things. And yet his reputation is kind of all over the place. In Ann Arbor, he's thought of as a guy that can do exactly what you saw him do against Ohio State, as a guy who outside of the 2 pick sixes in the TCU game, threw for 343 yards and 2 touchdowns. What are your personal expectations? When you look at a guy like him, what do you think he's capable of, and how far do you think Michigan can rely on him to be able to take the Wolverines to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, listen, again, I think he can get them to the college football playoff. He's shown that at this point, cracking that upper group. Like we've seen Georgia do it with a quarterback in Stetson Bennett, who is super talented, but not an NFL first-round draft pick by any means. That's not a prerequisite when you've got your roster in the place that some of these teams do. I think JJ McCarthy is a very good quarterback. He's not a great quarterback. Is probably like, and I hope that's not misconstrued as like a slight against him. But my thought is, if he was a quarterback that was capable of going out and affecting the game the way Drake May, Caleb Williams, Michael Penix were, Michigan would call football games differently. But they don't. They understand where their strength is up front in their running back room, using JJ McCarthy as a part of that. Because remember, back a year ago, that was the whole idea, is you would bring him in as this change of pace to be a guy that can go out here and get you some yards and affect the game with his legs. That was one of the things that I was stunned in that game against TCU. We didn't see more of early. You weren't trying to affect the game in that way. And so I think leaning into more of those and trying to really give his strengths more and more opportunities to shine like that, and then really take advantage of the early opportunities to try, even if it means a few less blowouts at the beginning of the season, really try and focus on that. Because I think continuing to develop that downfield passing attack and being multiple, you're going to be able to ride through most of your schedule this year if you're Michigan. Going on the same diet that you've operated on for the last couple of years, you can bully the Big Ten right now, and that's included Ohio State. But if your goal is, again, to transcend once you get there into that next wave, into the college football playoff teams that have traditionally been there, then I think giving this offense a little bit of a chance to be more dynamic would behoove them. And it's, again, a development we only saw in spurts last year. And if we see more consistently this year, could be that difference in the next step.
And that's certainly what Jim Harbaugh is saying that he wants to do this year. And he's been speaking about it all offseason. So it'll be interesting to see if they lean on the crutch that they have, which is the running backs, or if they actually do let JJ cut it loose. I have to ask you, because as a former offensive lineman yourself, Michigan's obviously got some new pieces this year. I mean, they returned the nucleus essentially of last year's offensive line, which was the second Joe Moore Award winning group. But they add Drake Nugent, a guy that when I talked to PFF's Max Chadwick, he said, I think he could be even better than Olu Oluwatimi, which is shocking to me. Then they bring in a guy like Ladarius Henderson, who played guard, but is moving out to at Arizona State, but moving out to tackle. You've got a guy in Miles Hinton, who's a former 5-star that comes in. He might not even make the starting lineup. You add those with Zach Zinter, Trevor Keegan, Carson Barnhart, and Trente Jones. I think it would be an understatement to say you're probably impressed with that group. But what is when you look at this group, what makes them so good? Why have they had the type of success? And when you look at this influx of talent that they're bringing in, do you think that they'll be able to sustain the level of success that they've already had?
Yeah, I think so, because again, you've got an architect there in Sharon Moore who's done a great job with that group. I think so often in college football, you can look around, coaching matters at that position more than anything else. Offensive line's the most unnatural skill set on the field. I would say offensive line and defensive back because your job is to go backwards against some of the best athletes on the planet and stop them using a very specific technique. There's nothing natural about playing that position. And so you've got to have someone that can communicate that effectively, having a coach that's also in, co-offensive coordinator, involved in the game planning, and what makes it there allows them to play to those strengths, allows them to play to the strengths of this group. I think they're incredible, and it sounds so rudimentary, but they get between their man and the ball. You might not see them driving guys 20 yards downfield. It might not be a drive off the ball kind of group, but they're incredible when it comes to angles. They're really technically sound in the pass protection game. They see things well as, 5 guys seeing things through one set of eyes type group. And they do have that desire to finish. And again, all those things sound really basic, but with offensive line, it's not like other positions where you're rotating groups. You've got different personnel package. It's you 5 out there if you're lucky. And the good groups are usually the ones that avoid injury, that get the same 5 out there through most of the year, but maybe have some depth. And to be able to roll out there with that consistency year over year to understand exactly what you're going to get and be able to rely on that group. It's why this team has been successful, because when you've got that as the bedrock and the foundation of your group in college football, you raise the floor of your team immediately. And again, these guys now understand the message. They've had the same voice teaching them, this is how we do business. They've been able to impart that into the guys incoming. And so to your point about young players cracking into the lineup, about transfer guys coming over, there's no mincing words about the way we do things here at Michigan if you're walking into that offensive line room. And I think that makes a world of difference.
Well, I have more questions for you, but I know you've got to jump, and I know you're up against it. So we'll have to try to bring you back another time, but even hopefully before the season starts. So I want to know your thoughts on this year's Ohio State Notre Dame matchup. I want to kind of get more into how Michigan and Ohio State maybe match up and some of that stuff. So we'd love to have you back sometime in the next couple of weeks.
No, definitely. It's that time of year, man. Fired up for it. We'll make it happen soon. It'll be a ton of fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate having you on, man.
Thanks for having me. Great time.
It's Mike Golic Jr. You've seen him everywhere. DraftKings, NBC, I think Fox sometimes. I don't want to pigeonhole him because I know he's kind of all over the place. So I was hoping to have him for the full half hour or so, but that he was up against it. Let's move that camera right there if you're watching. We're going to continue on here in just a moment. I do want to get into Tim Brando from Fox Sports. He went on the Daily Wire's Crane and Company, the show that's got former Michigan quarterback David Cohn. We're going to have him on hopefully either later this week or next week. And he has Michigan pretty high. So I want to discuss that in just a moment. All right. So it's really good stuff. Number one, I want to thank Mike Golic for coming on. Really, really great stuff as usual. I know it's always hard for Michigan fans sometimes to take someone who's played for a rival school and welcome them on. Maybe that's why we haven't had Josh Perry on, who's a acquaintance of mine. I love Josh dearly. We'll have him on eventually, but I think he's mostly spitting facts and certainly had a pretty good opinion of where Michigan is at this point. Certainly, I'm sure there's a couple things that y'all will disagree with, but overall, I think really amazing stuff. So Tim Brando went on Crane and Company and spoke to the Crane brothers and David Cohn earlier this morning, and he revealed his top 10 teams in college football. Now, Tim Brando, it's kind of funny because I feel like he's someone who's gotten a lot of derision from Michigan people, but I think today probably not the case, right? Because he has Michigan as his preseason number one. He joins Reese Davis in that mindset. And listen, I ain't mad at it. I don't think anyone's going to be mad at it, unless you just want the chip on your shoulder, which it does usually seem like that preseason number one, Georgia notwithstanding the last couple of years, does tend to end up not being the team. I always think about, I think it was the 2011 season, and I remember Oklahoma was the number one team, and they had like a behind the scenes practice thing. And the biggest thing I remember was a promo running on ESPN for college football. It was like a college. I don't think it was actually College Football Live, but it was like a special show, and it had Matt Stinchcomb constantly like, Oklahoma fans, you're going to want to hear this. And it's just one of those things where I was thinking, like, what is he actually going to say? That's going to like make this big difference. Nonetheless, Oklahoma did not finish number one that year. Michigan is who Tim Brando has as his number one team. He goes Michigan and Georgia And then I'm trying to go off memory, so I don't have to pull it off. I know Ohio State was number 5, Penn State was number 9, LSU I think was number 3, yes, and Alabama was number 4, and then you had Tulane at number 10. I know we're just kind of hitting all over the place with this. You had Kansas State in there as number 7, and it was kind of a wild ranking in some ways. Oregon was number 8 or number 6. No, number 6. Some of those schools, I look at Kansas State, for instance, and I say, okay, maybe, right? Chris Kleiman's been really, really good. They lost some pieces though, but I mean, they won the Big 12. They kind of go under the radar. A lot of people don't remember they won the Big 12 because it's TCU. And then you look at, I mean, Ohio State at number 5. My instinct is, well, that's too low because I'm just kind of accustomed to seeing like Michigan 2, Ohio State 3, or the FP or not the FPI having Ohio State at number 1. But ultimately, like if Ohio State loses a couple games, they could lose to Notre Dame, they could lose to Penn State, they could lose to Michigan. I mean, then they wouldn't be number 5, right? I mean, it would not surprise me if Ohio State lost 3 games. And I know the Buckeye lurkers are probably really angry at me for saying that, but I mean, it's not every college football team stays up and stays high all the time. Sometimes you miss the playoffs. Sometimes you're just not that good. And not having the quarterback, potentially, I mean, maybe Kyle McCord ends up being as good, better than CJ Stroud, but I wouldn't bet on it personally. But Michigan number 1. I would say I've kind of talked myself out of it to some degree. I think 2 or 3 is probably right. And that's just because that cornerback situation does concern me. I do think that bringing in Josh Wallace is great. I think hearing from the horse's mouth, essentially, that there are some concerns, pre-fall camp concerns. And I understand the schedule is conducive. You know, maybe it doesn't necessarily... maybe it doesn't work out, right? And you also have to stay healthy, and that's for every college football team. Michigan been bit by the injury bug a lot over the last decade at the worst possible times in a lot of ways. Michigan can stay healthy. And it's not to say other teams haven't. Ohio State's had, Nick Bosa be out and Jackson Smith and Jigba, and they've had moments where they haven't had one of their top players. But I mean, at the same time last year, no excuse. Michigan had a one-handed Donovan Edwards, had no Blake Corum. Had no Ronnie Bell a couple of years ago. So Michigan certainly had its moments. If Michigan can stay healthy, I think regardless, and if it can figure out that cornerback position and the edge rusher position, which I'm confident in, but is an unknown commodity. I think it's funny to some degree. People look at what Michigan doesn't have as proven commodities and say, well, but that's a big knock against them. And then they look at these quarterback situations, Alabama, Jalen Milroe, probably. They look at Ohio State and Kyle McCord. They look at Georgia with Carson Beck, and they're like, oh, that's fine. Penn State and Drew Allen, that's fine. Michigan, we don't know if if Braden McGregor is at least as good as Mike Morris. Ooh, kind of crazy. But still, I like the fact that Michigan is getting that attention, at least from certain people. Maybe I think that's good, work, but as long as internally they work towards it, which I don't see anything that tells me that they're going to not. However, that's what I thought, that's what I thought about, Michigan State in 2021. Granted, there are extenuating circumstances with that game. That's what I thought about TCU last year. I wasn't it wasn't just Michigan that was smug. I mean, all of us in the media were smug, and then Michigan was smug, and now you hear Mike Sanders still coming out there and saying we didn't take him as seriously as we could have because we just looked at the name on the jersey and said, well, we're going to dominate you, and they didn't do that. The coaches clearly did the same with some weird cutesy game plan. So it's up to Michigan to go out there and do what it's capable of. So I'm curious to see how this all ends up kind of working, and if they can keep their head atop their shoulders. I think that's the most important thing above all, including in the first 4 games, including in the month of October, especially in the month of November. And if they do that, they're going to be hard to beat, as Jim Harbaugh would say. All right, that's going to do it for us today. We will be back with more Michigan football stuff. No, I'm not having the mailbag. I still have a mailbag from 2 weeks ago that I haven't gotten to. So until further notice, we'll bring it back, but I want to get to those questions, and I'm sure I'll have to eliminate a bunch of stuff because it was like pre-Big Ten Media Days. But maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll do something else. All depends on what the news is. But we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Peace.